The ancient elders had a single law about humanity: never defy them. They ignored it. The chair they gave me was too small. That was always the first thing. 800 species represented in the conclave's main chamber, 800 different body types and gravitation preferences, and somehow every seat in the place still managed to make a human feel like a child at the wrong table. I had stopped taking it personally around year 6. By year 15, I just brought my own cushion and folded my hands in my lap and wore the expression of someone who had seen this particular show enough times to hum along to it. I was the only human in the room who had been here before. The other 3 members of our delegation were new. Owen, our trade representative, kept leaning forward like he was afraid he would miss a word. He had that fresh, eager energy of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment and had not yet discovered that the conclave mostly ran on paperwork, bad atmospheric recycling, and passive-aggressive seating arrangements. Claire, our cultural liaison, sat with the careful stillness of someone working very hard to appear calm and almost getting there. Dan, the military observer, had his arms crossed and his jaw set in the way men do when they are accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any room and have just started to wonder quietly whether that might still be true. I watched the other delegates file in. Cephalopods, crystalline hive forms. Something that looked like a weather pattern given a badge and a seat. Assignment: the Vethar with their triple-layered eye membranes, the Salhari who communicated through color shifts in their outer skin and were currently cycling through a pale amber that I knew from experience meant mild social anxiety. And I noticed what I always noticed, what I had noticed every single time I sat in this room for 11 orientations and had never quite let myself understand. They were watching us, not with curiosity. Curiosity has a particular shape, an open quality, leaning in. This was different. This was the way you watch something near a door you need to reach, the way you monitor a fire you have decided is contained but have not decided is safe. Every non-human delegate in that room had positioned themselves with the same unconscious calculation, not aggressive, not hostile, just aware, the way prey animals are aware of weather. I had spent 15 years telling myself it was professional interest. 11 orientations, 15 years. I was very good at telling myself things. Thesavan entered from the far corridor, and the room went quiet in the way rooms do when the thing walking in has been walking into rooms for 400 years, and the air itself has learned to make space. He was the Grand Archivist of the Galactic Conclave, oldest serving officer in the body's history, and he moved like a load-bearing wall, deciding where to stand. Each step was deliberate. Nothing about him was in a hurry. Nothing about him had been in a hurry for a very long time. He smelled faintly like a library that had been near a fire, not burned, just near one once long ago, and had carried the memory ever since. He took the center platform. The orientation began. I knew this speech: property rights, navigation corridor protocols, trade, arbitration hierarchy, 17 categories of diplomatic immunity, first contact, etiquette. I had it memorized the way you memorize a route you have walked so many times you stop seeing the road and just arrive. I spent the first 20 minutes watching Owen take notes with a furious energy. of a man who believed he was receiving sacred information for the first time in history. Claire leaned toward me and whispered, "Is it always this formal?" "It gets worse," I whispered back then. "Better, then worse again." Then the Savine paused. Not the pause of someone gathering their thoughts, the pause of someone who has been dreading a specific sentence for a very long time and has finally arrived at the moment they cannot avoid. "We arrive," he said, "at Article 1. The room shifted, not loudly, not with any visible signal, just several hundred species arriving simultaneously at the same careful stillness. The kind of stillness that is not relaxation, the kind that is preparation. I sat up straighter without deciding to. Article 1 is not a product of the current conclave, the Savine said. It predates this governing body by 390,000 years. In all that recorded time, it has never been debated, never been challenged, never been amended. It is the oldest law in documented galactic history, and it reads as follows. He read it. "You will not move against humanity in war, in predation, in political subjugation, or in provocation. You will not, you will not, you will not." 3 times. Like words you say when you need them to hold weight. I had sat through 11 orientations. I had heard these words 11 times, and I had never, not once, actually heard them. They had always simply been there, part of the background furniture in a room I had stopped looking at. Today, with 200 species sitting in that particular stillness around me, I heard every single word. You will not. It was not written to protect humanity. I knew that in the same breath. I understood it the same way you know the purpose of a fence by looking at which side the lock is on. This was not a law protecting us from the galaxy. This was a law protecting the galaxy from something the galaxy had once needed protecting from. I found Thessavine in the corridor. Afterward, just the two of us, the session on a short break, the hum of the atmospheric systems filling the silence between us. "The original law," I said, "Article 1. He looked at me the way you look at someone holding something they do not yet know is fragile. "It was written," he said, "after the last time." "The last time what?" He was quiet for 3 seconds exactly. "In Thessavine's particular economy of expression, 3 seconds was a very long answer. "You should return to your delegation," he said. "The afternoon session begins shortly." I let it go. I had spent 15 years becoming very skilled at letting things go. It was arguably my most transferable professional skill. The afternoon session opened with new business. The Reth Dominion's delegate stood. Rethaval was young by any species standard, and he wore the specific confidence of someone who had recently become important and had not yet learned the things that would complicate that feeling. He formally registered an objection to Article 1's place in the Foundation Code. He called it a relic. He called it fear-mongering dressed in the robes of history. He called it a myth sustained by civilizations too comfortable with their own superstitions to apply rigorous analysis to the evidence. He said all of this in a clear voice, and he sat down with the satisfied posture of a man who believed he had just said something brave. The room was so quiet I could hear the air. Owen looked at me. Claire had gone the color of old paper. Dan was doing the jaw calculation again, running numbers he did not like. Thespian noted the objection for the record without expression. Rathival sat back in his chair, looking pleased with himself. I looked at the 200 representatives around the room and I watched them, watching us, and I thought about the way Thespian had said after the last time. And I thought about the fence and the lock and which side it was on. God help me, I thought. He had no idea what he had just done. Neither did I, not fully, not yet. But the room was not alarmed. It was waiting. That was the difference, and it was the kind of difference that changes everything once you can finally see it. The first 72 hours were almost quiet. I say almost because there is a specific quality to the silence before something large begins to move, a tension in the air that is not sound but registers in the body like sound. The conclave station hummed along, delegates filed through corridors, the diplomatic cafeteria served whatever it was they served that was technically nutritional and universally disappointing. Owen drafted 3 separate memos about trade corridor adjustments and sent them to people who had not asked for them. I drank something that was not coffee and watched the news feeds and waited. The Vreth Dominion launched their offensive on hour 61. Not a raid, not a probe. Coordinated strike on 14 human colony. World simultaneously, time to coincide. Within a 4-minute window across systems. So spread out that normal communication lag should have made that coordination impossible. It was impressive, I gave them that. Sitting alone at my terminal at 3:00 in the morning while the station slept. Around me, whatever I thought of what they had done, what they were doing, the operational architecture of it was genuinely impressive. The timing alone represented months of preparation. The intelligence gathering that had gone into it, the mapping of our colony, defense positions, the selection of targets, the sequencing. Someone very capable had built this plan. Someone very capable had also, I noted, built it entirely on a set of assumptions. The conclave went from sleep to emergency session in 40 minutes. I was in the chamber when the first official damage reports came through. Representatives of 200 species, half of them still in whatever passed for informal dress among their kind, filling the seats with the controlled urgency of people who had been trained for exactly this moment and were now in it. The Vreth delegate, Rathival, sat in his section looking like a man who had lit a fire and was watching it take hold. Exactly as planned. I sat in our section, Owen to my left, running calculations on his personal terminal. Claire to my right, very still. Dan had been recalled to the human military liaison office the moment the attack began and was no longer in the room. I thought about Dan and hoped he was somewhere with better information than the rest of us. Thespian opened the emergency session with a speed that suggested he had been awake before the news arrived. He acknowledged the attacks. He formally classified the Vreth action as an unprovoked act of aggression under Conclave Charter Section 47. He noted that under that same charter, the Conclave's role in an intercivilizational conflict was documentation and mediation, not military intervention. Not intervention. Documentation. I heard that and I pressed my palms flat against my thighs and kept my face professional. They were not scrambling to help us. They were preparing to record what happened after. That was the role they had assigned themselves. That was the posture they had decided on before the First strike had even landed, because they already knew what came. After, they just had not told us what they knew. The session ran for 6 hours. I sat through all of it, species after species, offered formal statements of concern, carefully worded expressions of hope for peaceful resolution, procedural motions, to establish observation committees. All of it correct, all of it appropriate, under the charter, all of it completely useless in the way that correct and appropriate things so often are when something is actively burning. Rethavel spoke once briefly to reiterate that the Vreth action was a legitimate response to human expansionism in what the Dominion considered contested territory. He used the word legitimate 3 times. People who are certain they are right do not usually need to say it that many times. The feeds through the rest of that day were what you would expect: defense agency statements, colony emergency broadcasts, numbers that I tried not to turn into faces and mostly failed at. I knew people on 2 of those 14 worlds not well. One was Neil, an administrator I had worked with briefly during a trade negotiation 3 years earlier, a quiet, competent man who collected old maps and made excellent tea. I did not know if he was alive. There was no way yet to know. I did not look for his name on the lists. I was not ready to look for his name on the lists. Instead, I did what I was trained to do. I worked, I drafted language, I sat in 3 separate subcommittee sessions and translated human positions into forms the conclave could process. I drank the not coffee. I watched the feeds. I waited. On the second day, the Savin's aide found me. Vane was young by archival standards, only 80 or so years into what would likely be a very long career. He had the careful, watching quality of someone who processed information by collecting enormous amounts of it and then going somewhere quiet to think. He found me in the corridor outside the communication center and walked beside me without preamble. They expected a response within 72 hours, he said, not a question. He had been reading the Vreth's formal communications the same way I had. Negotiation, I said. They expected us to open negotiation channels. Their models projected a political fracture event within 6 days, Vane said. Different colony factions prioritizing different defensive concerns, creating internal pressure that would reduce response cohesion. That is a reasonable model, I said, if you have never actually studied what humans do when they are angry. Vane processed that. What do humans do when they are angry? I thought about how to answer that, honestly and without pride, which was harder than it should have been. We stopped negotiating, I said. On the morning of the 3rd day, the first anomaly report came through. The Vreth fleet assigned to the Kepler 7 colony had gone dark. Not destroyed, not engaged, not retreating, dark, communication silence. No distress signals, no wreckage, no debris field, 340 ships, and then nothing. And then the nothing just continued. Kepler 7 was not a major military installation. It was a mid-sized colony, mostly agricultural, a place where people grew food and raised children and watched the stars from a comfortable distance. It should not have been able to do anything to a fleet of 340 warships. Should not. I set down my not coffee very carefully. 2 more anomalies came in within 4 hours, then a third. The pattern was not random. The Vreth had committed forces across 14 systems, and they were going dark in a sequence that made tactical sense if you understood the logic well enough to read it. The logic was not retreat. I understood that even before the analysts did, because I grew up on a colony and I knew the difference between the silence of something running away and the silence of something that has stopped being visible for a reason. In the observation deck that evening, I stood with my hands on the railing and looked out at the stars, and an alien officer 3 stations down said something under his breath in Solarian. A short phrase, the kind you use when you are stating something you hoped was not true. I spoke Solarian. I spoke 17 languages. He said the prey is circling. Thessavane found me there. He put one of his secondary handling appendages on my shoulder with the deliberate care of a gesture he had rehearsed, the specific comfort posture his species used for the recently bereaved. It has begun, he said. I did not ask what it was. I did not ask what it was because, standing in that observation deck with the dark space spreading out beyond the glass and 340 ship sitting in silence, somewhere out there, I no longer needed to ask. I was beginning for the first time to understand what that fence was built to hold, and I was trying to decide if I was standing on the right side of it. On day 4, the Vreth High Command issued an internal order to all deployed forces. It was classified. Vane obtained a summary through channels I did not ask about and handed it to me on a narrow printed strip because he wanted nothing of it on the network. The order was for consolidation, not advance, not engagement, pull back, consolidate around defensible positions, establish perimeters, wait for assessment. 3 days into what they had planned as a clean, fast operation, the Vreth were no longer advancing. They had not been stopped. That was the part that was important to understand. Nothing had engaged them and driven them back. They had not met a superior force and been defeated. They had simply quietly begun to feel the shape of the space around them, and the shape was wrong, and they were smart enough to respond to that. They were smart enough. They were just not smart enough to have read the law and understood what it was telling them before they decided to ignore it. The archive vault had no lock. Thessavane had told me this in the corridor outside the main hall, speaking quietly while the morning session buzzed. Behind closed doors, it has never required one, he said. No one comes here unless they must. The way he said must was the way you say a word when you mean something much larger than the word contains. I came because I needed to understand what was happening out there, what humanity was doing in the dark, in the silence, in the space between the reports that kept coming in, stripped of details that should have been there. I was a diplomatic attaché. I translated humanity to the rest of the galaxy for a living. I had spent 15 years doing that work, and I had just realized, standing in an observation deck at 3:00 in the morning, that I might have been translating an incomplete version. Thessavane walked me down 4 levels below the conclave's operating floors. The air changed as we descended, cooler, drier, the kind of preserved stillness that belongs to very old things kept carefully. The vault door was a simple panel. It opened at his gesture without ceremony. He stepped aside. You are the first human who has entered this room, he said, because we were never curious enough, because you were never frightened enough. To need to be. He did not follow me in. The archive did not look like what I expected. I had anticipated grandeur, monuments to history. Instead it was rows of storage units, gray and functional, the kind of infrastructure you build when you are thinking about preservation rather than impression. The information was stored in formats spanning 400,000 years of recording technology. Thesavein had keyed the relevant section to a reader I could use. I sat down. I read. The record began 40,000 years before the current conclave existed. Humanity, it noted, had reached the stars once before. This was not the continuous civilization I knew. This was an earlier emergence, a species that had risen, expanded, and built before falling back into what the archive called a long developmental reset, which I recognized reading between the careful language as something I would call catastrophe. A collapse so complete it had left nothing visible by the time the current human civilization climbed back up to look for evidence of itself. The archive was not focused on humanity's first rise. It was focused on what had happened to them during it. The Vorcha Dominion had existed for 2 million years when humanity first arrived at their borders. 2 million years of expansion, governance, conquest, and institutional memory. They had absorbed or eliminated 43 emerging species in that span. They had a process for it. They had protocols and timelines and historical precedent going back so far that dealing with new civilizations was simply a routine function of their administrative apparatus. They had decided that the most efficient solution to a new spacefaring species that was growing quickly and behaving unpredictably was elimination. They were not irrational. Their reasoning was documented in their own records, which the archive preserved. Humanity showed the same expansion patterns as 3 previous species that had eventually become destabilizing forces in the Vorcha's territory. The logical response was to remove the variable before it became a problem. They were not wrong in their logic. They were catastrophically wrong in their application of it. The conflict lasted 11 years. I read that and sat with it for a moment. 11 years against a civilization that had been continuous for 2 million, that had an active military spanning thousands of systems, that had the institutional knowledge of 43 previous eliminations to draw from, that had every structural advantage in the opening engagement. 11 years. I read the Vorcha's own internal records. From year 4, the military commander's assessment, translated through 400,000 years of linguistic archaeology, described something the commander did not have a word for. Humanity had entered the war expecting to lose. That was the commander's analysis. Their initial defensive posture, the dispersal of their forces, the apparent disorganization of their early response, all of it read as a civilization trying to survive a few more years rather than win a war. And then somewhere in year 3, the commander noted the pattern changed. Not because humanity received more resources, not because a superior strategy was implemented from above. The change was something else, something the commander described carefully and without complete understanding. As they stopped trying to survive it, they became interested in the outcome. I read that 3 times. They became interested in the outcome. Year 5, the Vorcha offered terms. Formal communication offering negotiated settlement reduced. Territory guaranteed sovereignty in a defined zone, population protection. Agreements genuinely reasonable terms. From an empire that had never needed to offer anything. Humanity did not respond to the terms. Not a counter-offer, not a rejection. Just silence. Year 6, a second offer, better terms. The Vorchai's internal records showed genuine confusion. The administrative office responsible for first contact resolutions had no framework for a species that would not negotiate. Year 8, the Vorchai home system fell. I sat very still. Year 9, Year 10, Year 11. The archive's record of the Vorchai ended not with a surrender or a peace agreement, but with an administrative notation, no further communication received from Vorchai designated systems. All monitoring indicates absence of detectable civilization. Classification extinct. Extinct. Not defeated, not reorganized under new governance, not absorbed. Gone. Every world, every fleet, every archive, except the copies the other species had, made from a very safe distance. Every last remnant of 2 million years of continuous civilization gone inside. 11 years because they had made a decision about humanity, and humanity had become interested in the outcome. And then the record shifted to the aftermath. The surviving galactic powers of that era had convened, 18 of them in what the archive called an emergency collective session. They had debated for 3 years, not about humanity, about themselves, about what kind of law you write when you have just watched something happen that none of your existing frameworks can describe. The law they wrote was Article 1. You will not, you will not, you will not. Not because they respected humanity, because they had watched what happened to the last civilization that tried, and no one in that room wanted to be the next lesson. The Vorcha had not been evil, they had been logical, they had been powerful. They had 2 million years of successful precedent behind their decision. None of it mattered. None of it had mattered at all. I sat in the archive for a very long time after I finished reading. The storage units hummed faintly around me. The air was cool and very still. I thought about the Vreth, about Arithival standing up in that chamber, with his clear voice and his satisfied posture. I thought about 340 ships sitting in silence somewhere in the dark. I thought about the Savant saying, "You were never frightened enough to need to be." I thought about my people right now, moving through 14 systems in ways that were not appearing in any of the reports I was authorized to read. I stood up, I straightened my jacket, I walked out of the archive and back up through the 4 levels into the operational area of the station, where the lights were bright and Vane was waiting in the corridor with an expression that told me he had already read my clearance log and knew exactly where I had been. "Well," he said, "the Vorcha were logical," I said. "They were powerful, they had every structural advantage." Vane waited. "They made a mistake," I said. "They assumed the thing they were looking at was the whole of what humanity was. They saw the surface, made their calculation, and committed to it." I paused. "You cannot make a complete calculation about something if you are only measuring the part that is visible." Vane was quiet for a moment. "Did you find what you came for?" he asked. I thought about it honestly. I found something, I said. I am not sure yet if it is what I needed. I did not tell anyone what I had read. Not Owen, not Claire. Not the human military liaison office. That sent 3 requests to my terminal over the next 2 days asking for a detailed cultural assessment of Conclave. Sentiment. It would have sounded like something I did not have the right to say. And somewhere in the part of me that had spent 15 years translating humanity to the universe, a small and uncomfortable voice was asking whether understanding something fully was the same as being proud of it. I did not have an answer for that. Not yet. Week 3 of the conflict in the Conclave Observation Station had developed the specific atmosphere of a place watching something it cannot influence and has decided to document with great thoroughness instead. Analysts filed reports, representatives filed statements, the diplomatic cafeteria ran out of its third most popular item and replaced it with something gray and technically sufficient. I read every report I could access. I want to say I was reading with detachment, professional distance, the cultivated neutrality of a diplomat doing her job. I want to say that I was watching my people fight, and I was reading the reports with my hands pressed flat against the terminal, and my heart behaving in ways I had not asked it to. The Vreth had advantages that should have been decisive. Their drives were faster, their shielding technology was more advanced in terms of raw defensive capacity, their numbers were significantly superior across 12 of the 14 contested systems by any standard military calculus. The engagement should have gone one way. What the Wraith had not modeled was adaptability, not adaptation in the biological sense. Tactical, cultural, systematic adaptation, the kind that happens when a species has spent most of its history in conditions it did not choose, solving problems it did not create with resources it did not have enough of, the kind of problem solving that comes from long practice with the particular challenge of being outmatched, where the Wraith's technology was superior in direct engagement. The human forces stopped having direct engagements. The conflict became asymmetric in the first week. By week 2 it had become something that did not fit the Wraith's existing strategic vocabulary, not guerrilla warfare in any classical sense, not terrorism, not simple evasion, something that kept changing shape every time the Wraith's command structure produced an analysis of it, so that the analysis was always accurate about the previous version and useless about the current one. Vane showed me the Wraith intelligence assessment from week 2 without comment. I read the line that stopped me. They appear to be operating without a centralized command structure, yet with unified intent. We cannot identify the head of their operational planning. We do not believe there is one. Owen, reading over my shoulder, said quietly, that is because there isn't. I looked at him. We don't fight that way, he said. We never have, not when it really matters. I thought about that for a long time. After he walked away. Week 3, day 4. I had a conversation with Vane that I have thought about every day since. We were in the small observation annex, off the second corridor, just the two of us watching a star field that contained somewhere in its depth the ongoing process of humanity deciding how angry it was going to be. Vane had been studying the conflict. Academically, it was his job. He approached it with the same careful collection of data he brought to everything, building a picture from facts the way you build a structure from materials, one piece at a time. He said, I have a question. It may be a poor one. Ask it. Why do your people fight harder when they are losing? I poured myself a drink from the station's limited but earnest supply of spirits and thought about how to answer that without either diminishing it or making it sound like something it was not, because losing means something to us. I said, we have built an entire culture around it. We have songs about it. We have holidays for it. We name our children after people who lost greatly, but lost without giving up. We have religions built on the theology of the person who stood alone against the impossible thing and did not survive, but did not stop either. You want to break a human being's will to fight, you do not hurt them. Pain is something we are very practiced at. You make them feel that their pain will not be remembered. That is the thing we cannot survive, the feeling that it meant nothing to anyone, that no one is watching, that the loss will be forgotten. Vane processed this in his way, collecting it and placing it carefully. The Vreth executed the colony ships. He said, in the first wave, the civilian transports attempting evacuation from 3 of the contested worlds. Yes, I said. That was a mistake, he said, not a question. Sweet merciful nothing, I said, you have no idea how large a mistake that was. A silence stretched between us, comfortable in the way silences are when both parties are thinking the same large thought from different directions. The Vorchai, Vane said eventually. Carefully. I know, I said. Your people are not the same as they were 40,000 years ago. No, I said, we are not. And I meant it. I wanted to mean it. I thought about the 14 colonies and the civilian transports and the names I had started to look for on the casualty lists, and I thought about what I had read in the archive about a civilization that stopped being interested in terms. And I thought, we are not that. We have 40,000 years of history between us and that. We are not that. I thought it hard enough that it almost felt true. Week 4, the Vreth High Command sent a 3rd consolidation order to their deployed forces, the most aggressive yet pull in, establish a defensible core, stop trying to hold the 14 systems, protect the Vreth home systems. They were not losing the war yet in any territorial sense. They still controlled significant space. They still had a functioning military apparatus, but something in their command structure had shifted in a way that the public communications did not show, but the internal analysis, which Vane continued to share with me, silently and without explanation, made visible. They were afraid, not of the forces they could see, of the forces they could not account for. Week 6, a human diplomatic communication arrived at the conclave, requesting that the station formally note mediation. The communication was polite. It was professionally worded. It said that humanity was open to discussing mediation under specific conditions, and that a formal response to those conditions was requested within 14 days. Owen read it and then looked at me with an expression I recognized as the look of someone who has just understood a joke 3 seconds after everyone else laughed. We're not going to accept mediation. He said. No, I said. Then why send the communication? Because it gives the Wraith command. Something to hope for, I said. Something to plan around, a potential exit, and while they're planning around the potential exit, they're not focused on whatever is moving through their defensive perimeter in the dark. Owen stared at the communication on his terminal for a long moment. We learned that, he said, from 40,000 years of being the smaller side of every conflict we ever survived. Yes, I said. That is not a comfortable thing to be good at, he said. No, I said, it is not. Week 7, Day 2, the Wraith sent a delegation to the conclave requesting third-party mediation, not in response to the human communication, independently, on their own initiative. Before the 14-day window had closed, the delegation arrived in formal attire. Their lead envoy was not Reth Ivil. Reth Ivil had been replaced, the manifest showed, by a senior diplomat named Grathsen, older, quieter, with the specific expression of someone who has been handed a situation they did not create and are trying to manage with the resources they have left. Grathsen addressed the conclave. Council, the chamber was full, every delegation present. I sat in our section with Owen and Claire and a different military observer because Dan had been reassigned somewhere I was not told about. Grathsen said, we were told the law was superstition. We were told the history it referenced was myth. We were told that this civilization was not exceptional by any measurable standard, that the protections written around it were the product of ancient fear rather than legitimate risk assessment. He paused. We were told many things. No one in the chamber spoke. The Vreth Dominion formally requests the conclave's assistance in establishing a ceasefire framework and opening negotiation channels with the human government. I watched the Savin's face, 400 years old, a face that had been in this chamber for more of its history than any other face currently present. He noted the request for the record without expression. 2 days later, the Savin brought me humanity's formal response to the mediation request. He handed it to me on a printed strip, the way Vane had given me things because certain information belongs on paper rather than networks. I read it. It was not a rejection. It was not an acceptance. It was a list of preconditions, and the preconditions were exact and detailed and clearly written by people who had been thinking about this list for some time before anyone asked for it. I read through the list and I felt a mix of things. I did not have clean names, for pride was in there. Something colder was in there alongside it. Something that asked in a voice I kept trying to quiet whether winning and justice were the same thing, and whether being right about a law made the application of it something you should be proud of. I was not proud of what had happened to the civilian transports. That was not complicated. The rest of it was more complicated than I had a framework for. I folded the printed strip, held it, did not immediately pass it to the Vreth delegation, gave myself 30 seconds in the corridor with it, just 30 seconds to feel whatever I needed to feel before I went back to being the person who translated humanity to the universe. 30 seconds. Then I went back in. 6 months from the day Rethaval stood up in an orientation chamber and called a 400,000-year-old law a relic of superstition. And here we were in the Same chamber with the same seats and the same atmospheric hum and the same bad ambient lighting. And the Savine was on the center platform, about to read an amendment into the permanent record of galactic history. I had brought my cushion. Some habits. The chamber was full, not just the usual delegation size, every species with conclave representation had sent expanded groups. The viewing galleries above the main floor were packed with observers who had no vote but wanted to be present in the way that witnesses need to be present. I had been in this chamber for 11 orientations and 1 emergency session, and 1 restructuring debate, and this was not like any of those. This was the feeling of a room that knows it is inside a moment. The specific awareness of being present for something that will be in the record for a very long time. Owen sat to my left. He had aged in 6 months in the way people do when 6 months contains more than 6 months of weight. He was quieter than he had been. He took fewer notes. He had been to the memorial service for the colony worlds and come back different in ways he did not talk about. Claire was on my right. The wide-eyed stillness she had arrived with had compressed into something steadier, less surprised, more present. She had started learning Sohari in her spare hours. I had told her it was a good language too. No, she had said she wanted to understand what the room was feeling without needing a translator. I had found that unexpectedly moving. The seat beyond Claire was empty. Lana had been on Kepler 4 when the initial strikes landed. She was alive, we knew. That she was in a medical facility and would recover, the report said, but she was not here. The empty seat was doing what empty seats do, which is hold the shape of the person who belongs in it. I did not look at it more than once. Grathsen sat in the Vreth section. He had been in the station for 6 months, managing the armistice negotiations with the exhausted focus of a man carrying something heavy for a very long distance. We had spoken professionally, formally, several times over those months. He was not the same person who had made the request in that council session. He was quieter, more careful with his words. He had the look of someone who had read the archive, and I later confirmed that he had, and that he had read it completely, and that whatever he had found there had done to him some version of what it had done to me. He caught my eye across the chamber once before the session opened. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he looked away. I understood what that was. It was 2 people who had both read a document they could not unread, acknowledging each other across the space of everything that had happened because of it. Thessavane opened the session. The formal record was established. The armistice terms were entered. The casualty figures were noted both sides. Without comment, the territorial agreements were registered, and then Thessavane moved to the amendment. The conclave has convened to formally amend Article 1, he said, the oldest provision in galactic law for the first time in its recorded history. The room was extraordinarily still. The original text reads as follows: You will not move against humanity in war, in predation, in political subjugation, or in provocation. You will not, you will. Not you will not. He paused. The pause was the same one he had used 6 months ago, the same weight in it. The amendment approved by the council reads as follows. He read it. You will not move against humanity in war, in predation, in political subjugation, or in provocation. You will Not you will not, you will not. Further, should any civilization choose to disregard this law, the remaining signatories are under no obligation to intervene on the offending civilization's behalf. This law does not exist to protect humanity, it exists to protect you. The silence after those words was the longest I had ever heard in that chamber. It existed to protect you, not us. You. Owen exhaled very slowly beside me. I did not look at him, I was looking at Thessalvane, at the way he held the chamber in that silence, at the 400 years of history behind his eyes, at the specific expression on his face that I had not seen there before. Not satisfaction, not vindication. Grief, I thought, the specific kind that comes from being right about something you wished you were wrong about. The amendment was voted into the record. The vote was unanimous. Every delegation, every species, even the Vreth, especially the Vreth. Grathsen signed with both primary hands. His species used both primary hands for things that required full commitment. He did not look relieved. When he finished, he looked like a man who had just signed his name to an understanding of the world that he could not now unown. I signed for the human delegation. My handwriting was very steady. I was surprised by how steady it was. After the session closed, the chamber broke into the careful, professional movement of people filing out and beginning the process of documenting a historic moment. I stayed in my seat for a moment, just a moment, letting the room empty around me while I sat with what had just happened. 6 months ago, I had been sitting in a different version of this chair, thinking about an orientation speech I had heard 11 times, and something in me had finally cracked open just far enough to let in the question I had been walking past for 15 years. And now here I was, on the other side of a war, in an archive, in a silence that still lived in the dark parts of my thinking. And Article 1 had been amended for the first time in 400,000 years, and the amendment said, this exists to protect you, not us. You. I stood up, picked up my cushion, walked out. Thessalvane was in the corridor. Of course he was, 400 years old, and he was always exactly where the moment needed him to be. You've read the full archive, he said. Yes. And I thought about the Vorcha, the 11 years, the civilization that stopped being interested in terms somewhere around year 4 and never started being interested again. I thought about what I had read in the archive in the voice of a Vorcha military commander who had no word for what he was describing. They became interested in the outcome. We are not them, I said. We are not the Vorcha. There is 40,000 years of distance between us and that. Thessalvane was quiet in the way of something that has been wrong before and learned from it. No, he said, you are not yet. He said it without cruelty. He said it with the specific care of something very old, telling a truth it wishes were unnecessary. Not yet. I held that for a moment, let it sit in my chest where it intended to live. What is the second part of that sentence? I asked. The part you are not saying. The part I am not saying, Thessalvane said, is that the Vorcha were not always what they became. There was a period very early when they were something different, before the first war, before the first elimination, before the 2 million years of institutional habit built itself into something no single decision could turn back. He looked at me with his 400-year eyes. Every civilization that has ever become a problem, he said, was at some point not yet a problem. That is the nature of yet. I looked at him for a long moment. Then what do you suggest? I suggest, he said, that the species capable of writing a second law is the species that has understood the first one, not merely survived it, not merely enforced it, understood it. He walked away down the corridor. His footsteps were very deliberate on the floor, the steps of something that knew exactly where it was going and was in no hurry because it had 400 years of practice getting there. I stood alone in the corridor for a while. Then I walked to the observation deck. The stars were very clear from there. Thousands of them, millions of them. Probably, if you counted what the sensors could reach beyond what the eye could distinguish, somewhere in that spread of light were the 14 colonies rebuilding. Somewhere in it was a Vreth dominion that had just signed its name to an understanding it had bought at enormous cost. Somewhere in it were all the things that were coming next, all the species still climbing toward their first ship, all the situations that had not yet become situations, all the future that existed in the dark and did not yet know what it would need. Somewhere in it was the shape of the thing humanity might be 40,000 from now, or 11 years from now. I thought about the archive, about the Vorcha's military commander and his careful, confused description of what he was watching, the way he had written we had expected them to stop. I thought about how we had not stopped. And I thought about the Saving's word. Yet, I pulled out my terminal, opened a blank document. The cursor sat there patient, waiting, the way blank documents always wait, with no opinion about what you put in them. I typed in the subject line, proposed a second law. I stared at it. I did not know what it said yet. That was the honest truth of it. I had read the first law and I had read what came before it, and I had watched 6 months of a war that should not have needed to happen, and I had sat in a chamber where the amendment said this law exists to protect you, and somewhere in all of that there was something I was trying to get to, something I was reaching toward, formulation that might be large enough to hold the complicated truth of what we were, not the dangerous version, not the version the archive held in its cold gray storage units, the other version, the one that sent diplomats instead of fleets most of the time, the one that built colonies and grew food and collected old maps and made good tea, the one that wrote songs about loss and named children after people who did not give up, the one that kept reaching for the next thing, always the next thing, the new species and the new star and the new question and the new attempt to do something better than the last attempt, the one that was right now sitting alone on an observation deck trying to figure out how to write a law about itself that was honest. We were very good at surviving. We were very good at winning. We had not yet figured out how to be finished. That was the thing about us. That was the truest thing I knew about my species. After 15 years of translating us to the universe, we were never finished. There was always the next thing, always the next version of ourselves we were trying to become, never quite arriving, never quite satisfied, never quite done. The Vorcha had been finished with the question of what they were. That was why they could make a calculation and commit To it without doubt, they knew what they were. They had 2 million years of being. Exactly what they were. We had never known that. We had never known what we were not. Completely, and we had never stopped arguing about it, and every version of ourselves we managed to build lasted long enough to crack and split and become the foundation for the next version that also cracked and split. And here we were, still reaching, still trying, still carrying the archive in our collective chest like a warning. We were always one wrong decision away from becoming relevant again. I looked at the blank document. I typed, "The second law must be written by the civilization that understands what the first one caused." I stared at it, deleted it, typed again, "The second law is not for the galaxy, it is for us." Stared at that, deleted it, tried again, "We are not finished, we do not know yet what we will become." That "not yet" is not a warning, it is the hold of the work. I sat with that for a long time. The stars did not change, they were not interested in what I was writing. They had been here for a very long time before any of this, and they would be here for a very long time after. Indifferent to the arguments and laws and wars and archive rooms of the small, complicated things that built ships and reached for them. I thought, we are not the Vorcha. I thought, we are not yet anything we cannot still choose to be. I thought, that is the most frightening and the most honest thing I have ever believed about us. And then I thought about Lena and her medical facility, about Neil and his old maps and his good tea, whose name I had finally looked for on the lists, and found alive, about the empty seat in our delegation, about the 14 worlds rebuilding, about Owen going quiet in a way that held weight, about Claire learning Salarian so she could understand the room without needing to ask, about the shape we kept trying to make of ourselves, imperfectly, stubbornly, without ever quite arriving. I did not finish the document that night. I saved what I had, closed the terminal, stood up from the cold railing of the observation deck where I had been standing long enough that my hands ached from the chill, and I put the terminal back in my jacket, and I thought, tomorrow. There was always tomorrow. That was the thing about us that the archive had not fully captured, not the part about what happened when we became interested in the outcome, not the part that had made the surviving civilizations write a law and then another law and stand very still whenever we walked into rooms. The part that the archive had not captured was this: we were always still writing the next thing, even after everything, especially after everything. We were still sitting on observation decks in the dark with blank documents open, trying to find the words for what we were trying to be. That had to count for something. I thought it had to count for something. I was going to keep believing that until I had a reason not to. I walked back inside,